On a snowy Christmas Eve, a young waitress worked the final shift at a nearly empty diner in rural Idaho when an old man stepped in from the cold. Wearing a threadbare coat and eyes full of quiet sorrow, she thought she was simply offering kindness to someone forgotten by the world. But when he leaned in and whispered 7 unexpected words, her reality began to unravel. That moment set off a chain of revelations tied to a decades old secret, a wartime promise, and a legacy of sacrifice her father had never spoken of. What began as a small act of compassion would soon reveal a hidden protector, a life debt still unpaid, and a truth waiting silently in the falling snow. This is how it all began. The snow fell quietly over the sleepy town of Ashton Creek, Idaho, a place where winters seemed to press pause on the world. At the edge of town stood a modest little diner, tucked between a shuttered antique shop and a faded laundromat. Inside, the warm glow of string lights danced against fogged windows, but the silence was heavy. Grace Sullivan, 24, moved quietly behind the counter, her hands used to the rhythm of pouring coffee and wiping down laminate booths. She was a part-time waitress, working holiday hours most people avoided, but tonight she didn't mind. In truth, she didn't have anywhere else to be. This was her first Christmas without her father. The grief hadn't come all at once when he passed suddenly 10 months ago. It seeped in slowly, like winter frost creeping along the corners of her heart. James Sullivan had been a quiet man, the kind of father who fixed broken faucets and listened more than he spoke. His absence echoed in the smallest things. The way her mother stirred her tea without sugar now, the silent seat at the dinner table, and the empty space beneath the Christmas tree. Grace lived with her mother in a small second-story apartment overlooking the railroad tracks. Money was tight but manageable. Her dreams of medical school had been packed away into boxes labeled someday, stacked high behind rent, grief, and responsibility. Tonight, the diner was nearly empty. Just a few scattered souls lingered in the booths, stragglers clinging to coffee cups, hoping to delay returning to whatever loneliness waited outside. Her manager, Joe, leaned on the counter, scribbling into a ledger. "We're closing in 15, he called out without looking up, his tone more exhausted than harsh. Grace nodded but didn't speak. She had always liked Christmas, even after it became bittersweet. There was something about it that still whispered of hope, like the final flicker of a candle before dawn. She looked out the fogged window. Snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the sidewalks in quiet forgiveness. She didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything. Not just for her, but for the legacy of a promise made decades before she was born. The bell above the diner's door jingled, a small, almost fragile sound, and Grace looked up instinctively. A gust of cold air slipped in as the door creaked open, followed by the slow, deliberate steps of an elderly man. He stood in the entryway for a moment as if unsure whether he was welcome. His coat hung loosely from his shoulders, worn thin at the seams. His shoes were scuffed and fraying at the toes, barely holding together. Snow dusted his long silver hair, which fell past his collar in loose, time-worn strands. There was a hollowness to his cheeks, but his eyes, clouded with age, still carried a strange clarity, as though they saw more than they let on. Joe didn't even glance up from the counter. "We're closing in 15, he called flatly. The message was clear: keep walking. Grace hesitated. Something tugged at her. Instinct, maybe, or something deeper. Despite the soft ache in her feet and the tiredness in her bones, she stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. "I'll take care of him, Joe," she said quietly. "It's Christmas Eve," Joe sighed, finally looking up with a resigned shrug. "Don't stay too long." Grace nodded and approached the man, her voice soft but steady. "Come on in, sir. Warm booth by the window still open." The man nodded, offering the faintest smile, and followed her with slow, careful steps. She guided him to the corner booth, where the multicolored lights from the shops outside cast a warm shimmer across the table. He eased into the seat like someone who hadn't rested properly in a long time. "What can I get you?" she asked, pulling out her notepad. "Something warm?" He looked at her, not with surprise or embarrassment, but with quiet humility. "Just some soup, if there's any left, and maybe a glass of water." She nodded. "Coming right up." In the kitchen, Grace found the last serving of potato soup still steaming in the pot. Without thinking, she ladled an extra large portion into a bowl. Then, glancing at the near empty dessert case, she spotted the lone gingerbread cookie left untouched all day. She placed it carefully beside the bowl. When she returned, she set the tray in front of him. "I added a cookie," she said gently. "No one should go without something sweet on Christmas Eve." The man's weathered hands curled around the warm bowl, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. He stared at the soup for a long moment before lifting the spoon. "This is very kind of you," he said, quietly. "More than you know." Grace smiled faintly. "I don't have much to give," she said honestly. "But letting someone go hungry on Christmas, that just wouldn't be right." He nodded once and began to eat. Slowly, deliberately, as if each spoonful was a sacred act. There was reverence in the way he held the bowl, in the silence he kept as he ate. Every now and then, his eyes drifted around the diner, not aimlessly, but with purpose, as if he were searching for something familiar or remembering something long buried. Grace watched him from behind the counter, unsure why her heart was pounding. She had no way of knowing it yet, but she'd just reopened a chapter of a story that began decades before she was born. The diner clock ticked past 11:45 p.m. The other customers had quietly slipped away, their chairs pushed in, their presents forgotten. Only Grace and the old man remained, held in a kind of hush only Christmas Eve could bring. She moved through the quiet space, clearing mugs and wiping down tables, occasionally glancing toward the window booth where the man now sat with his hands resting gently on the empty soup bowl. He hadn't touched the cookie. Grace approached, holding a clean rag in one hand and a practiced smile on her face. "All finished?" she asked gently. The man looked up, and this time his eyes met hers fully. For a heartbeat, Grace couldn't move. There was something about his gaze, not just the intensity, but the familiarity. It was like standing in front of a photo that shouldn't recognize you, but somehow does. She reached for the bowl, but he stopped her with a soft, rasping whisper. "You know," he said slowly, "you look just like someone who once saved my life." Grace blinked. "I... I'm sorry?" His face didn't change. He leaned slightly forward, and what he said next wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it slid into the quiet like a stone through still water. "You are your father's daughter in every way." The word struck Grace like a sudden wind. She froze. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a second, the world around her dimmed, as if time had paused just to let the meaning settle. Her father? He'd been gone almost a year. A quiet, thoughtful man who never raised his voice, who never sought praise. She'd grown up knowing he'd served in the army, but the details were always vague, always followed by a gentle, "It was a long time ago, sweetheart." Now this stranger, this tired, weathered man, was looking at her like he'd known her for years, like he'd known her father, not just from a distance, but intimately, deeply, like he owed him something. Before she could speak, before she could ask who he was or how he knew anything about her or her family, the man reached into his coat pocket. With deliberate care, he unfolded a $5 bill, creased and worn, and placed it on the table. Far more than the soup had cost. Then he looked at her again, this time with a sadness in his eyes that made her throat tighten. "Merry Christmas, Grace Sullivan," he said. And then, without another word, he stood and made his way to the door. She didn't move at first. She was still caught in that last sentence. She knew her name. She wasn't wearing her name tag. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't said a single word about who she was. The door creaked as he opened it. Snow flurried in around his coat, and then he was gone, vanishing into the night as silently as he had arrived. Grace rushed to the door, heart hammering. Outside, the street was empty, just a fresh trail of footprints disappearing into falling snow. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She lay awake, the quiet hum of the radiator filling the silence in their modest apartment. Her mind replayed every detail, the man's eyes, his voice, the strange familiarity in the way he said her name. And those 7 words, "You are your father's daughter in every way." She could still hear them. They echoed with a weight that didn't make sense. Unless he had known her father, truly know him. The next morning, while her mother strung lights across their tiny Christmas tree, a tree barely 3 feet tall but adorned with years of handmade ornaments, Grace couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mom," she said, voice low, "something happened at the diner last night." Her mother glanced over, hands pausing mid-knot with a thread of golden tinsel. "What kind of something?" Grace took a breath. "An old man came in, cold, alone. I gave him soup, a cookie." Her mother smiled softly. "That's just like you." Grace shook her head. "That's not the part. Before he left, he looked at me and said, 'You are your father's daughter in every way.'" The smile vanished. Grace watched her mother's fingers tighten around a glass ornament shaped like a bell. It dangled there, unmoving, suspended in time like the moment itself. "And he knew my full name," Grace continued. "I wasn't wearing a name tag. I didn't tell him. I didn't say a thing about Dad." Her mother sat down slowly on the couch, the color draining from her face. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "What did he look like?" Grace described the long silver hair, the weathered face, the worn coat, and those eyes, sharp despite age, as if they held secrets too heavy for memory. Her mother listened in stillness, and then, after a long pause, she whispered, "That matches exactly how your father used to describe his commanding officer from his time stationed in Germany." Grace's breath caught, but Dad never talked about that. "Hmm, he had to die," Jess said, shaking her head slowly. "He told me once that his service was classified. Said he couldn't say much, only that there were things best left in the past. But he always spoke of one man, his CO, the one he saved. A man, he said, changed everything." Grace stared out the window, snow beginning to fall again. "Why would he come here now? Why me?" Her mother didn't answer, but her eyes were glossy with memories that suddenly felt too close. 3 days later, just as Grace was finishing a quiet morning shift at the diner, a man walked in. Not old, not local. He wore a dark suit and moved like someone used to being watched. He scanned the room, then walked straight to her. "Grace Sullivan?" he asked. She nodded, unsure whether to be nervous or curious. "Name is David Mercer," he said in a low, careful voice. "I represent the Veterans Affairs Special Recognition Division. Would you have a moment to speak privately?" In the quiet of the diner's back room, Grace sat across from David Mercer. The walls were lined with faded employee notices and calendars stuck in seasons long past, but the man across from her seemed like he belonged somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with vaults and clearance levels, not chrome napkin holders. Mercer reached into his coat and pulled out a small plastic sleeve. Inside was an old photograph, faded with time but preserved carefully, like something sacred. "This was taken in 1972, he said, sliding it across the table. Grace picked it up. In the black and white image, 2 men were caught mid-mash motion. A medic, younger than she'd imagined, face streaked with mud, was dragging a wounded soldier through a thick forest. The medic's helmet was tilted back slightly, revealing a distinct red cap underneath. Mercer tapped the man in front. That's your father, Private James Sullivan. He was pulling a wounded comrade out of a kill zone near the East German border. Grace's breath hitched. She had never seen her father like this, so fierce, so urgent, so alive. In the picture, he looked like someone from a war film, not the man who'd taught her how to ride a bike and grilled corn on Sundays. And the man he saved, she asked. Mercer's expression grew solemn. Colonel Robert Campbell, one of our highest-ranking Cold War intelligence officers. He vanished shortly after his retirement in 1989. Officially? Presumed dead. Grace stared at the photo, her fingers trembling slightly. Mercer continued. But facial recognition from your diner's security footage matches. The man you served on Christmas Eve, the one who knew your name, was Colonel Campbell. Grace felt her world tilt. But why, after all these years, she whispered. Mercer leaned forward. We believe he made a vow the night your father carried him through enemy fire. A life debt, one he intended to repay. He paused, giving her space to breathe. We also believe, he said more gently now, that Campbell has been watching over your family for a very long time. Quietly, invisibly, after your father passed, he chose to make one final appearance, to pass the torch in person. Grace remembered now. Things that once felt like coincidence, a scholarship that arrived just when tuition seemed impossible, the anonymous donor who covered her father's medical bills in his final weeks, the job offer her mother received out of nowhere when they almost lost the apartment. She swallowed hard. He was behind all of it, wasn't he? Mercer nodded. Every act, every check, every chance that showed up when it felt like the world was closing in, that was Campbell. Grace stared at the photograph again, her father's face illuminated by grit and urgency. A man she'd thought she knew. And a man who had been quietly protecting her all along. 3 days later, Grace stood at the edge of a place that didn't exist on any public map. The facility looked ordinary enough. Gray concrete buildings, blank windows, and a parking lot scattered with snow. But the checkpoints, the silence, and the uniformed guards moving with precision told a different story. She had been invited, not summoned, but there was little room for refusal in the quiet authority of Mercer's tone. Inside, she was led down a corridor that smelled of cold metal and institutional sterility. The walls were bare. No plaques, no honors, just a single door at the end. It opened with a soft click. A man stood waiting, his posture crisp, his silver eagle insignia gleaming against the deep navy of his uniform. Miss Sullivan, he said, offering a firm but brief handshake. I'm Colonel James Whitaker. Thank you for coming. Grace nodded, unsure what to say. She followed him into a conference room without windows. On the wall, a digital screen flickered to life, displaying a map of Cold War-era Germany. Whitaker stood before it. What I'm about to share with you is classified, but in light of recent events, we've received temporary clearance. He tapped several red markers along the eastern border. Your father wasn't just a medic. He was part of a specialized reconnaissance unit, deep field operations. The night captured in that photo was during a mission that stopped a potential nuclear escalation. Grace's knees nearly gave out. She lowered herself into the nearest chair. Never told us anything, she murmured. He taught me how to bait a fishing line. He helped with my algebra. But this? No clue. Wouldn't have, Whitaker said simply. They were under strict oath. Even decades later, they carry that silence. He turned off the screen and walked to a cabinet, removing a thick folder. He placed it gently in front of her. Inside were documents, trust deposits, letters, scholarship confirmations, an old insurance policy. Grace leafed through it, eyes widening as the pattern became clear. Colonel Campbell had built a quiet net of protection around her family. Year after year, crisis after crisis. All of this, Grace whispered, because my father carried him out of that forest. Campbell didn't just survive that night, Whitaker said. The intelligence he carried prevented a catastrophe. Millions of lives may have been spared because your father, wounded and outnumbered, chose to carry a stranger through fire. A younger officer entered, whispered something to Whitaker, then exited again. Whitaker turned back to Grace, his expression softening. There's someone who'd like to speak with you. The screen on the wall blinked on. And then, there he was, older, sharper, dressed in a crisp blazer, no longer the frail man from the diner, but still unmistakably him. Colonel Robert Campbell. Grace, he said, voice stronger than before. Forgive the theatrics. Old habits die hard. Her breath caught. Colonel Campbell? You don't owe me formality, he said, with a hint of a smile. But I owe you the truth. He leaned closer to the camera. Your father saved more than my life. He saved history. That mission, it was one breath away from war. He made sure I lived to stop it. Grace's eyes filled. He never said a word. He wouldn't. Campbell's voice softened. He didn't need medals. He had you. He told me once in the quiet after a mission that all he wanted was for you to grow up in a world where you never had to carry what he did. Campbell's gaze was steady, the same unflinching look he had given her in the diner. When I saw you offer food to a man you thought had nothing, no hesitation, no pity, just kindness, I knew. His legacy lives in you. Grace couldn't stop the tears that slid down her cheeks. She didn't try to. The quiet soldier in the photo, the father who used to sneak marshmallows into her hot cocoa, who never missed a school play despite limping by the end of the night. He had been a guardian of peace, a silent protector, a man who bore the weight of the world and never spoke of it. And now the man he saved was looking at her through a screen, eyes misting too. There's one more thing, Campbell said gently. He reached out a frame. When his hand returned, it held a sealed envelope. When your father passed, I knew my time was short too. I had one vow left to fulfill, to ensure that the future James Sullivan once dreamed for his daughter would not end in silence. Whitaker slid a matching envelope across the table toward Grace. Inside were official papers signed and sealed. A trust fund, matured and sizable, was established in her name. It included full tuition to any medical school she chose, living expenses, and an open recommendation from the highest levels of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Grace's breath caught. Her hand trembled over the signature line, not from shock, but from a deep, overwhelming sense of something larger than herself. My father, he remembered I wanted to be a doctor. Campbell nodded. He mentioned it often, said you had healing hands, like his, gentle but strong. Grace pressed her palm over her chest as if to keep her heart from spilling over. Campbell continued, You don't owe us anything, Grace. But if you choose to walk this path, know that it is paved by courage. Your father didn't live for medals. He lived for meaning. And through you, that meaning continues. And the screen faded to black, but his voice lingered like an echo that had waited decades to find a home. Grace sat still for a long moment. When she finally stood, she wasn't the same woman who had walked in earlier that morning. She carried a weight, yes, but it wasn't the burden of grief anymore. It was something far stronger. Legacy. She left the room with her father's posthumously awarded service medal in one hand and the letter confirming her full scholarship in the other. The story would never make the news, but in the quiet circles of military halls, a grainy clip from a diner's security camera would circulate. a silver-headed man bowing his head before a photo of a long-lost comrade, whispering a name only he in the past could still speak. 1 year later, the diner looked different. The same fogged windows, the same creaky chairs, but tonight every table was filled. Elderly veterans in worn coats, single mothers holding tired toddlers, and long-haul truckers with road maps in their pockets. No one was alone. And at the heart of it all stood Grace. No longer in an apron, the quiet waitress in the corner, but the sponsor, the host, the thread holding it together. She moved between tables with ease, smiling and checking in. A staff of volunteers helped carry trays and refill mugs, but at one particular table, centered directly beneath a string of golden lights, no one sat. Instead, there was a single plate of gingerbread cookies. Beside it, a framed photograph of her father, Private James Sullivan, red medic cap and all. Next to the frame sat the cap itself, gently resting on the table as if its owner had just stepped away for a moment and would be back any second. A small card on the table read, "The Sullivan Table, for those who served and those still watching." Grace placed a fresh sprig of evergreen by the photo. It was a tradition now, one she'd created to honor not just her father, but the invisible bonds between strangers who never forgot to care. As she turned to greet the next table, a hesitant voice interrupted her. "Excuse me," a boy said. He looked no older than 10. His jacket was a little too big, his eyes wide but cautious. A foster child, someone had whispered earlier, placed just last week. Grace knelt beside him. "Yes, sweetheart?" He pointed at the red cap. "Was he a soldier?" Grace smiled. "He was a healer," she said softly. "Someone who helped people when they needed it most." The boy looked at the empty chair. "Can I sit there?" Grace nodded, her voice catching. "My father always believed no one should eat alone on Christmas." The boy climbed into the seat, carefully reaching for a cookie. And just like that, the table wasn't empty anymore. Across the room, the door chimed. David Mercer entered quietly, nodding respectfully toward Grace. He handed her a plain white envelope. She opened it and immediately recognized the handwriting. "The circle continues. Well done." Little signature. No need. She looked up instinctively, scanning the faces in the room. Somewhere, she believed, maybe near the back, just beyond the glow of the lights, Colonel Campbell was watching, or someone carrying his promise forward. But the details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the thread hadn't broken. It would become a chain. A week later, Grace received her acceptance letter to Columbia Medical School. She'd hang it one day on a wall beside her father's medal and the red medic cap where it belonged. Not in memory, but in motion. Because some gifts don't come wrapped in ribbons or boxes. Some are given in silence, in a whisper, over soup, in footprints in the snow, in a child's hand reaching across a table no longer empty. Later that night, after the last pie had been served and the last chair tucked in, Grace remained in the diner. The volunteers had gone, the lights were dimmed, only soft jazz played low from the jukebox, accompanied by the steady tick of the wall clock above the register. She sat alone at the booth beneath the golden lights, the Sullivan table. In front of her, the red medic cap sat still and sure, its color bright even in the hush. Her father's photograph looked back at her, his smile the same one she'd seen each Christmas morning as a child. Quiet, proud, steady. Snow began to fall again outside, blanketing the streets in peace. Grace glanced at the empty chair across from her, then smiled, because she understood now it was never truly empty. Not when someone had carried a promise across decades. Not when strangers became family over soup and cookies. Not when one quiet act of kindness opened a door into history and carried a legacy forward. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small note, the one she'd found beneath the $5 bill a year ago. Thank you for doing the right thing. Some debts take a lifetime to repay. Grace read it once more, then carefully tucked it into her journal, next to a pressed sprig of pine and a photo of the little boy who had chosen to sit at her father's table. She stood, gathered the plate, and turned off the last light. Outside, the night was silent. The snow continued to fall, and in a town too small for secrets, a ripple of quiet kindness kept moving forward, outward, infinitely.